I didn't shout when Richard slid the folder across the table and told me, without even glancing up, "Your promotion review has been removed from the agenda." There was no explanation offered, no trace of regret, just the quiet assumption that I would absorb it the way I always had, the way I'd absorbed every last-minute crisis, every extra responsibility quietly dropped onto my plate, every vague promise about next quarter or next year. He expected compliance. What he didn't understand was that this time I wasn't stunned into stillness. This time, something in me had finally gone still in a different way. Final. And I was holding leverage he never imagined I would use. If you've ever been dismissed like that, reduced to a line item someone could erase without looking up, tell me in the comments. And if you're new here, I'd appreciate you subscribing to hear how this unfolds. For 15 years, I walked through the glass doors of Red Line freight systems, believing effort still mattered. I believed that arriving early, staying late, and keeping an entire region's logistics from collapsing would eventually be seen, respected, rewarded. I built my career the slow way, the way people my generation were told was honorable. No shortcuts, no office politics, just measurable results. I coordinated freight through mountain passes during whiteout blizzards. I rebuilt mouting networks in the middle of wildfire evacuations. I held our on-time delivery numbers steady when competitors couldn't manage it on calm weeks. I knew every driver's name, every client's temperaments, every fragile junction in our supply chain where a single delay could spiral into a multi-million-dollar failure. When emergencies hit, no one called Richard, they called me. Yet somehow he was the one sitting in executive meetings while I kept the region stitched together hour by hour. For a long time, I told myself that recognition simply arrived later for people like me, the ones who didn't posture or self-promote, the ones who carried responsibility quietly so the company could keep its promises. I didn't see how dangerous that belief was. While I stayed loyal, Redline learned exactly how far they could stretch me. They learned I would fix whatever broke, regardless of how little they invested back into me. I designed the winter logistics protocol that saved them nearly $2 million in penalties during the 2019 storms. I renegotiated carrier contracts when fuel prices spiked. I salvaged a major client relationship after Richard mishandled their account review. Every time I did it calmly, professionally, mistaking obligation for pride. People called me the backbone of the region. Richard called me dependable. I thought it was praise. It took years to understand that dependable is what executives call you when they know you'll carry twice the load for half the recognition. My team trusted me in a way they never trusted leadership. Marcus would stand in my doorway, tension etched across his face, and say, "If you leave, Amelia, this place falls apart." I laughed it off, but part of me knew he wasn't exaggerating. I trained them. I protected them when leadership tried to pin failures on poor planning from above. Their loyalty wasn't to Redline, it was to me. And for a long time, that loyalty was the only thing that kept me going. I believed it mattered. I believed Richard when he said the VP role was just waiting on final approval. I believed because I needed to believe. After 15 years, I couldn't imagine they'd look me in the eye and lie. I was wrong. I can admit that now without embarrassment. Because my real mistake wasn't trusting them, it was assuming any company would ever value quiet competence over their own convenience. The day Richard proved that assumption false is etched into my memory the way bad diagnoses are. Nothing dramatic at first, no raised voices, just a subtle shift, a tone, a posture that told me something irreversible was approaching. He had scheduled the meeting 3 months earlier, labeling it final review and transition planning. I repeated that phrase in my head for weeks, letting myself believe that after 15 years of carrying Redline's operations, I'd finally received the authority that matched the work. By the time I reached his office at 2:59 p.m., I'd rehearsed how I would accept the promotion, how I would thank him, even though we both knew it was overdue. What I hadn't rehearsed was how to react to being dismissed. Richard didn't look up when I entered. He stared at a stack of papers, tapping his pen like he was waiting for a ride, not the woman who had quietly saved his career more times than he realized. "Have a seat," he said. I sat, smoothing my blouse, ignoring the heaviness forming in my chest. Finally, he leaned back and sighed, the kind practiced exhale people use when they want to seem burdened by decisions that benefit them. "I'll be direct," he said. "The board decided to pause the VP expansion." He didn't wait. He repeated it slower, as if repetition made it easier to swallow. "Budget pressures, timing issues, no one's fault." When he finally met my eyes, I saw it. Guilt, fear, something he couldn't fully hide. He'd known this outcome long before I walked in. I reminded him that the package had already been approved, that he'd told me the last step was documentation. He shrugged it off. "Things change. We all have to adapt." That word landed hard. I had been adapting for years, adapting to invisibility, adapting to unpaid responsibility. Adaptation was the only reason Redline survived. When I asked whether compensation would at least reflect the responsibilities I already carried, he looked away. "Roles and pay must align with structure," he recited. "When the seat opens, you'll be first in line." I'd been first in line for 2 years. It was a holding pattern designed to keep me quiet. In that moment, clarity settled. This wasn't about budgets. It was about control. Promoting me meant paying me. Keeping me where I was meant extracting everything I had without consequence. Richard stayed safe, comfortable. His nephew stayed positioned near the pipeline without competition. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. His eyes said enough. I stood, thanked him for the update, and walked out with a calm he mistook for acceptance. He had no idea he'd just triggered his own downfall.
The hallway felt thinner as I walked back to my office, like the air itself knew something had ended. I closed the door and sat, staring at my screen. For years, I told myself patience was virtue, loyalty was currency, and recognition simply took time. Sitting there that afternoon, the truth finally crystallized with painful clarity. They never intended to reward me. The promotion was never waiting on a board meeting or budget approval. It was a story they told me to keep me doing the work no one else could. The realization wasn't loud. It was quiet, sharp, and clean, like a blade sliding into place. I opened my email, not to work, not to clear my inbox or review weekend coverage schedules, but because I needed something to anchor myself. That's when I saw the messages I'd ignored for months. Recruiters, competitors, former colleagues, people who had left Redline and said, "You're too good to stay there, Amelia. They're using you. Come join us." I'd always brushed them off, telling myself Redline would come through. Now, reading those subject lines, operations director role, leadership opening, we need someone like you, I felt something shift. It wasn't desperation, it was possibility. The email that stopped me cold was from 3 weeks earlier from Jordan Reyes, CEO of Summit Flow Logistics. I'd heard the name whispered with equal parts respect and envy. He'd built Summit Flow from a local carrier into a tech-driven powerhouse challenging national brands. The subject line was simple. "Would you consider a conversation?" I clicked it open. "Amelia, I've followed your work for years. Your operational strategies at Redline have become reference points in our hiring and training programs. If you are ever open to leading at a higher level, we have a VP seat that needs someone with your instincts. I'd value the chance to speak with you." There it was, direct, clear, no games, no carrots on strings. A real offer from someone who didn't need to be convinced of my worth. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, the smallest tremor running through them. Part of me felt disloyal. Part of me felt furious that I even felt disloyal after what Richard had done. But the strongest part felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. I typed a reply without hesitating. "Jordan, thank you for reaching out. I'm available this weekend if you still have time." I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. It was 4:22 p.m., 38 minutes after Richard told me to keep doing what I'm doing, 38 minutes after 15 years of loyalty officially expired. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, feeling the first real breath I'd taken all day. My phone buzzed. A new email. Jordan had responded almost immediately. Tomorrow morning, 9:30, Summit Flow HQ. Been waiting for your yes. Waiting for my yes, not waiting for me to prove myself, not waiting for me to accept scraps disguised as opportunity, waiting for me. I looked around my office, my neat files, my operational binders, the wall calendar marked with deadlines and crisis prevention protocols I had designed myself. For the first time, I didn't feel pride. I felt clarity. Redline didn't deserve me, they never had, and by tomorrow morning I would finally stop pretending they did. Summit Flow's headquarters sat at the edge of Denver's tech district, all steel lines and floor-to-ceiling windows. Nothing like Redline's outdated brick building that smelled faintly of stale coffee and panic. As I walked through the lobby the next morning, the receptionist greeted me by name before I even introduced myself. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how differently this company operated. Jordan met me outside the conference room, hand extended, expression warm but sharp in a way that made it clear he missed nothing. "Amelia, I'm glad you're here," he said, not as a pleasantry, but as a certainty. I'd spent most of my career watching executives pretend to care during meetings they barely prepared for. Jordan was the opposite. He sat across from me with a binder full of my work, process diagrams I'd built, efficiency models I'd designed, risk analyses I'd written during crises. Redline pretended it never happened. "I've studied your systems for years," he said. "You built Redline's stability, but they'll never give you the authority to lead because your leadership threatens theirs." It was startling hearing the truth spoken so plainly. At Redline, everything was half said, half promised, half explained. Here, everything was direct, clean, sharp, and honest. "You don't know what happened yesterday," I said cautiously. "I don't need to," he replied. "I know how companies like Redline treat the people who make them successful. They mistake loyalty for weakness until it costs them everything." He opened a folder and slid a contract toward me. Not a promise, not an invitation to wait for budget approvals, a contract. "Vice President of Regional Operations," he said, "full authority, salary at the top of the industry range, performance equity, and the freedom to build your team without interference." My throat tightened, not from emotion, but from an overwhelming sense of recognition. This was what respect looked like. This was what leadership was supposed to feel like. Not begging for approval, not waiting for crumbs, not being told to be patient while they handed opportunities to less qualified relatives. But I had spent 15 years carrying a company that never carried me back, and the weight of that hesitation still lingered. "Why me?" I asked quietly. "Because you've already been doing this job," he said simply. "The only thing you've been missing is the title in the right environment." There was no flattery in his voice, no manipulation, just truth, the kind that settled into your bones and felt impossible to deny. I typed a reply without hesitating. "Jordan, thank you for reaching out. I'm available this weekend if you still have time." I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. It was 4:22 p.m., 38 minutes after Richard told me to keep doing what I'm doing. 38 minutes after 15 years of loyalty officially expired. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, feeling the first real breath I'd taken all day. My phone buzzed. A new email. Jordan had responded almost immediately. "Tomorrow morning, 9:30, Summit Flow HQ. Been waiting for your yes." Waiting for my yes, not waiting for me to prove myself, not waiting for me to accept scraps disguised as opportunity, waiting for me. I looked around my office, my neat files, my operational binders, the wall calendar marked with deadlines and crisis prevention protocols I had designed myself. For the first time, I didn't feel pride. I felt clarity. Redline didn't deserve me. They never had. And by tomorrow morning, I would finally stop pretending they did. Summit Flow's headquarters sat at the edge of Denver's tech district, all steel lines and floor-to-ceiling windows. Nothing like Redline's outdated brick building that smelled faintly of stale coffee and panic. As I walked through the lobby the next morning, the receptionist greeted me by name before I even introduced myself. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how differently this company operated. Jordan met me outside the conference room, hand extended, expression warm but sharp in a way that made it clear he missed nothing. "Amelia, I'm glad you're here," he said, not as a pleasantry, but as a certainty. I'd spent most of my career watching executives pretend to care during meetings they barely prepared for. Jordan was the opposite. He sat across from me with a binder full of my work, process diagrams I'd built, efficiency models I'd designed, risk analyses I'd written during crises. Redline pretended it never happened. "I've studied your systems for years," he said. "You built Redline's stability, but they'll never give you the authority to lead because your leadership threatens theirs." It was startling hearing the truth spoken so plainly. At Redline, everything was half said, half promised, half explained. Here, everything was direct, clean, sharp, and honest. "You don't know what happened yesterday," I said cautiously. "I don't need to," he replied. "I know how companies like Redline treat the people who make them successful. They mistake loyalty for weakness until it costs them everything." He opened a folder and slid a contract toward me. Not a promise, not an invitation to wait for budget approvals, a contract. "Vice President of Regional Operations," he said, "full authority, salary at the top of the industry range, performance equity, and the freedom to build your team without interference." My throat tightened, not from emotion, but from an overwhelming sense of recognition. This was what respect looked like. This was what leadership was supposed to feel like. Not begging for approval, not waiting for crumbs, not being told to be patient while they handed opportunities to less qualified relatives. But I had spent 15 years carrying a company that never carried me back, and the weight of that hesitation still lingered. "Why me?" I asked quietly. "Because you've already been doing this job," he said simply.
"The only thing you've been missing is the title in the right environment." There was no flattery in his voice, no manipulation, just truth, the kind that settled into your bones and felt impossible to deny. I signed the offer before I allowed fear or habit to pull me back. Jordan extended his hand again, but this time his smile held something like satisfaction. "One more thing," he said. "If you know good people who deserve better than Redline can give, I'm ready to hire." I thought of Marcus's worn-out determination, Ava's brilliance overlooked by Richard, Tyler's quiet talent buried under Red's chaos. I didn't promise anything. I didn't need to, because I knew the second I walked out of that building that talent follows respect, not titles, and Redline was running out of both. I walked into my new office at Summit Flow at exactly 8:32 a.m. on Monday morning, still half running on adrenaline from the weekend. The space wasn't large, but it was mine. Clean desk, crisp screens, a window overlooking the district. No stacks of overdue reports dumped on my chair. No morning crisis waiting for me like a trap. No Richard pacing outside my door pretending he was the one keeping the region functional. I had barely logged into my system when my personal phone buzzed. Not once, not twice, but in a non-stop rhythm that made my hands go still before I even picked it up. The first notification was an email forward from a colleague still at Redline. Marcus's resignation letter, effective in 2 weeks, submitted at 8:07 a.m. I stared at it for a few seconds, letting the words sink in.
Not because I was surprised, but because seeing it in writing made something inside me shift permanently. Marcus had spent years carrying the heaviest operational accounts without recognition. I'd watched him get passed over for promotions 3 times, in favor of managers Richard cherry-picked from his personal circle. "If you ever leave, Amelia, I'm right behind you," he had said once in a late-night shift when we were both exhausted and too honest to hide it. I never thought he meant it literally, but apparently he did. At 9:12 a.m., my phone vibrated again. Another forwarded email, this one from Ava. Her resignation letter was shorter, cleaner, colder. She'd been polite for years, swallowing disrespect from supervisors who dismissed her ideas, even when her solutions were the ones that saved Redline tens of thousands. She didn't owe them diplomacy now. By 9:55 a.m., a third notification. Tyler. Calm, steady Tyler, who never complained but carried more technical coordination knowledge than half the management team combined. His letter was even simpler. "I'm grateful for the years of experience. It's time to grow elsewhere." I knew what that meant. He was following me. They all were. Not because I recruited them, I hadn't said a word, but because people don't stay where they're diminished, and they don't leave unless they finally see a place where they'll be valued. At 10:23 a.m., my phone rang. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. I answered anyway. "Amelia," Richard said, voice already fraying at the edges. "What's happening?" 3 senior staff resigned this morning. 3. "I'm aware," I said, keeping my tone steady. And, he snapped. "Don't play games. Did you talk to them? Did you encourage this? They're your people." "They're adults, Richard," I replied. "They made their own decisions." Silence. A heavy, panicked kind of silence that told me he finally saw the edge of the cliff he'd been stepping toward for years. "We need to discuss your role," he said quickly, like he could still pull me back into his orbit. "Your promotion? The one you paused?" I interrupted indefinitely. "That promotion?" He exhaled sharply, defensive. Now things were misunderstood. We can revisit the timeline. Timeline. Always a timeline. Always a someday, a later, a soon. I looked around my new office, the sunlight on the glass, the fresh start humming with possibility, and felt nothing but clarity. "That won't be necessary," I said. "I resigned Friday evening. I'm VP at Summit Flow now." His sharp inhale cut through the line. "Summit Flow, Amelia, they're our competitor." "They're the company that offered me the respect you never did," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Quiet truth can break harder than yelling ever could. "You can't take my team," he said, desperation finally surfacing. "I'm not taking anyone," I said. "You pushed them away. You just didn't notice until they walked out the door." And before he could reply, I hung up. The avalanche had started. And Richard, for the first time in his comfortable career, had nothing to dig himself out with. The thing about operational collapse is that it never starts with an explosion. It starts with silence. An email unanswered, a shipment delayed by an hour, a client asking a question no one has the knowledge to answer. That first week after I left, Redline's silence turned into something much louder. By Tuesday, I started receiving messages from employees who hadn't spoken to me in years. "Amelia, nobody knows how the winter route protocol works. Richard is trying to guess his way through it." Then another, "The new coordinators don't understand the carrier escalation chain. We're missing deadlines." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I already knew exactly what would happen when you yank the spine out of a system built by people leadership never bothered to understand. By Thursday, things began to slide publicly. A major manufacturer reported an 18-hour delay because the replacement coordinator didn't know the alternate route I created 2 winters ago. That single mistake triggered penalty fees, Redline usually avoided with my planning. Friday morning, 1 week after the meeting Richard used to humiliate me, I heard from 3 different people that Redline's on-time delivery metric had dropped almost 10% in 8 days. 8 days. 15 years of stability undone in a week because the people who built the foundation were gone. At Summit Flow, I watched the fallout from a distance while building out our expansion strategy. Jordan didn't ask for gossip, he didn't celebrate Redline's pain, he focused on the future. My future, our team's future, the clients who were already reaching out to us because they sensed instability across the city. Still, the updates kept coming. More resignations, more complaints, confusion spreading through Redline's floors like a slow electrical fire. Employees who once brushed off my concerns were now messaging me directly, saying, "Amelia, you were right. They never understood what you did for them." It didn't bring me joy, it brought clarity. Leadership at Redline had spent years believing operations would run themselves, that loyalty could be taken for granted, and talent would stick around no matter how many times they delayed a promise. They had never been tested. Now they were. Week 2 was worse. Another shipment mishandled. 2 more coordinators quit. A client issued a formal review citing service inconsistency. Richard, panicking, hired a consultant at $15,000 a week to stabilize processes. But you can't reverse engineer 15 years of institutional knowledge from a binder. You can't buy back loyalty once it's broken, and you can't rebuild respect when everyone watched you squander it. By day 19, Redline wasn't declining, it was free-falling. And Richard, the man who told me to be patient, was discovering what happens when the person holding everything together finally stops carrying the weight. 2 weeks after Richard told me to be patient, my phone lit up again with his name, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt absolutely nothing. No anxiety, no obligation, no instinct to fix whatever disaster he was drowning in.
I let it ring twice before answering, not out of spite, but because I wanted him to feel the space that had finally opened between us. "Amelia," he said, forcing steadiness he didn't have, "we need you back." The desperation in his voice wasn't subtle anymore. It was raw. "Operations are spiraling. Clients are threatening to pull contracts. We've lost—" He paused, as if saying it out loud might make it worse. "We've lost 7 people this week." I stared at the sunlight spilling across my new desk at Summit Flow, the calm hum of a functioning, well-led operation behind me. "I'm sorry you're dealing with that," I said, and I meant it. Not for him, for the people left suffering the consequences of leadership negligence, but Redline isn't my responsibility anymore. He rushed in, words tumbling over each other. "We can reinstate your promotion immediately. VP title, a significant salary increase, equity, real equity, complete operational authority, whatever you need." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was surreal hearing him offer in panic everything he claimed Redline couldn't afford just 16 days earlier. "Richard," I said quietly, "you told me the budget wouldn't support the VP seat. You said the timing wasn't right." "Things changed," he snapped. "You know they changed." "Yes," I said, "they changed because the people who held your operations together finally left." Silence, heavy, defeated. "Amelia," he said, softer now, "you built this region. You know we can't function without you. Please, just meet with us. Let us make this right." But there was no making it right, not after years of excuses, not after weaponizing my loyalty, not after pushing my team to the edge until they had no choice but to walk away. I looked out at Summit Flow's shipping yard, organized, efficient, humming with activity under a system I was already shaping. "I'm exactly where I should be," I said, "and the people who trusted me are here too, thriving. You didn't lose us this month, Richard. You lost us years ago, when you decided our loyalty was cheaper than fairness." He exhaled a long, hollow sound. "We can't survive this, Amelia." "Then you should have treated the people who kept you alive better," I said. "Good luck." I hung up before he could answer. I didn't feel triumphant, I felt resolved, because the truth was finally undeniable. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to stop saving the place that was never willing to save you. In the months that followed, the story of Redline's collapse stopped being office gossip and became something colder, something studied, an example of what happens when leadership mistakes loyalty for limitless endurance. Industry journals dissected their downfall. Analysts traced every misstep back to the same root cause. Supply chain conferences used their case as a warning for executives who believed people like me were replaceable. Meanwhile, at Summit Flow, my world grew wider. I was leading a team twice the size of the one I'd left behind, shaping new protocols, negotiating contracts with companies that once swore they'd never leave Redline. They came to us quietly at first, then openly, even proudly, saying they wanted stability, transparency, and leadership that actually listened. And every time a former Redline client signed with Summit Flow, I felt the same steady truth settle deeper inside me. They weren't following a company, they were following competence. One afternoon, nearly a year after Richard canceled my promotion, I was invited to speak at a regional leadership forum. The room was full of mid-career managers, tired eyes, hopeful faces, people who had spent years swallowing disrespect because they were afraid of starting over. I told them the truth. I wish someone had told me sooner. Document every promise, I said. Pay attention to what leadership does, not what they say, and understand that when a company keeps pausing your future, what they're really telling you is that they don't see you in it. They listen the way people listen when they recognize their own story being spoken out loud. Afterward, a woman about my age approached me quietly. "How did you know it was time to leave?" she asked. I didn't hesitate. "When staying started to cost me more than leaving," I said. "When I realized the promotion I was waiting for was never coming, I walked out of that room knowing something I had earned the hard way. The collapse of Redline wasn't my revenge, it was the invoice for 15 years of ignored loyalty finally coming due. And I didn't have to lift a hand for the truth to reveal itself. All I had to do was stop carrying the weight that was never mine alone." When I look back on everything that happened, what stays with me isn't the drama or the downfall, it's the clarity. I learned that loyalty can be a beautiful thing, but only when it flows both ways. The moment it becomes a one-way street, it turns into self-betrayal disguised as dedication. For years, I believed patience was the price of success, that if I just worked harder, waited longer, or proved myself one more time, someone in power would finally do the right thing. But life doesn't reward the quiet suffering of people who keep carrying burdens others refuse to acknowledge. It rewards the moment you recognize your own value and refuse to let anyone discount it again. In my case, the consequence Richard faced wasn't something I orchestrated, it was something he created, and that taught me another truth. Sometimes revenge isn't loud, sometimes it's simply walking away and letting the system expose its own cracks. The universe doesn't always hand you justice, but it never lets hypocrisy stand forever. And while forgiveness can be freeing, I also learned that silence, choosing not to return, not to justify, not to rescue, can be the sharpest, cleanest knife you ever wield. For anyone hearing this and recognizing pieces of their own life, your worth isn't measured by what your bosses say, nor by the promises they make to keep you in place. It's measured by the impact you bring, the people who trust you, and the standard you hold yourself to when nobody else is watching. If you feel stuck, overlooked, or undervalued, don't wait for someone to choose you. Choose yourself, even if it means stepping into uncertainty. The life you want rarely exists inside the comfort of being needed. It exists in the courage of being respected. How to get started today. Write down every promise or commitment you've been given, then ask if actions match the words. Update your resume or LinkedIn quietly without announcing anything. Reach out to one person who values you and let them know you're exploring new possibilities. Spend 10 minutes imagining the life you want, not the life you've settled for. If this story resonates with you, tell me in the comments.